Ever wonder why scam calls feel so specific? Why they somehow already know your name, your city, or even your address? It's usually because of data brokers. These companies collect your personal information from across the internet and sell it online, usually without you even realizing it. Things like your phone number, home address, family members, and even places you've lived. And once your information is out there, it spreads fast. That's where Aura comes in. Aura automatically finds your personal information on data broker sites and submits removal requests for you. Then Aura keeps monitoring to help make sure your information stays gone. You can even see where your data was found and removed. And Aura goes beyond data removal. You also get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Right now, you can try Aura free at aura.com/hidden. That's aura.com/hidden.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Carlton Chief Gover, and I am thrilled to have you join me as we explore the fascinating and rich histories of North America's Great Plains. Today, I am joined by Dr. Spencer Pelton and Alexis Hollander. Spencer is the Wyoming State archaeologist, and Alexis is a grad student in EEB. And I always mess up those letters. It's evolutionary ecology. What is it? What does that stand for, Alexis?
I am in the program in ecology and evolution at the University of Wyoming.
Gotcha. Ecology and evolution.
Yeah.
Thank you for that correction. And so today we're continuing on our collaboration with the Plains Anthropological Society. And so we're highlighting Spencer and Alexis's, well, among other co-authors, early 18th century Plains Indian adornment at the Riverbend site, Wyoming. Spencer and Alexis, thank you both so much for being on the podcast. Spencer, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, I'm doing great. Just got my daughter hopefully on her way to bed. Had some delicious Japanese food out of Beijo Dua, Laramie's finest sushi, as Alexis probably knows. Alexis, you might have your own choice for sushi in this town, in Wyoming. Sushi in Wyoming, right? You got to be pretty picky about it.
Yeah, I'm a miso girl myself.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Excellent. How are you doing this evening, Alexis?
Really good, thank you.
Of course. All right. So Spencer, right off the bat, what is the Riverbend site? Where are we at in Wyoming? And what's the site significance within Wyoming and Plains archaeology in general?
Okay, Riverbend. I've typically talked to you about really old stuff in Wyoming, but for this study, we fast forwarded to basically right before contact or right at contact in the early 1700s AD. Riverbend is I'm considering it a proto-historic, so kind of people were getting his Euro-American trade goods, but it was prior to kind of widespread written accounts of the region. It dates to about that age, early 1700s, and right in the middle of Wyoming, in the city of Casper, is where it's located, right on the banks of the North Platte River. This site was excavated primarily by avocational archaeologists in the late 1970s, and really primarily by one person who's also a co-author on the study, Carolyn Buff, who's been a decades-long member of the Wyoming Archaeological Society and a really important person in the archaeological community in the state. So how it came about was this site was discovered when they were expanding Casper to the west, putting in a new housing development. And when they started putting the blades down, they started kicking up artifacts. Some local archaeologists caught wind of that and were able to convince the developers to pause development on the residential development for just a little while they salvaged some information from it. And so throughout a few years in the late 70s and early 80s, primarily Carolyn Buff by herself, it should be noted, and she went out there a lot, just kind of on the weekends and dug by herself, excavated this site, but also was assisted by some volunteers. And they ended up excavating a lot of this site before it was destroyed by this housing development. Not a whole lot's been reported on it since. Carolyn wrote a small report back in the early 80s. And then a guy named Dave McKee, who's a really great archaeologist in Wyoming, ended up being a Forest Service archaeologist. He wrote a master's thesis on it as well about the fauna from the site. But other than that, there's not been a whole lot reported on this site. The gist of it, as we went into it, we knew that it was probably a winter campsite. The argument was made by that it was occupied by the ancestors of the Eastern Shoshone based on some artifact styles and some obsidian in the assemblage. But prior to our work on it, really most of what was known about it was the faunal assemblage. McKee did a really great study of this assemblage, which we cite extensively in there, that found this really diverse assemblage of not just bison, which is really typical, but also a ton of other ungulus deer, pronghorn. I want to say there's like a dozen or more species of birds. I can't remember the exact count, but there's just tons of birds in this assemblage, which is really an interesting aspect of it and something you don't see a lot. So just a really rare site in a really rare time period. You'd think that a site dating the early 1700s would be kind of easy to find, but it's really not. That time period in particular is, for whatever reason, a very difficult time period to find archaeological sites in Wyoming. And this is by far the best of them that we know about.
I was about to say, I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've ever had you on the APN talk about something that wasn't Paleo-Indian or mammoth or Clovis in nature. So really happy to see you talk about this, like at the periphery of contact. So roughly what, 80, 1700, 1725. What was it that gave you guys originally that age for the site?
So Carolyn, in collaboration with Chuck Rear, a former faculty member at Wyoming, who actually was the steward of this assemblage for a lot of years, and he should have a lot of credit for looking after this collection for a long time and also making it available to study for student term papers and things like that. So Chuck Rear, really big name in this as well. But they originally thought it was dated this time period for a couple of reasons. One, there was a lot of chipped stone in this site, so it seemed to be a pre-contact site. But two, there was a really small number of metal artifacts from this site that didn't seem to just be intrusive from later time periods. This metal seemed to be associated with the occupation. And also, and this ended up being proven wrong later, but there was a horse burial at this site. And that was really the thing that led them to think it was an early 1700s site. Later, Will Taylor at CU did genetics on this horse and found that it was a post-contact horse. It was a modern horse that just happened to get buried in this archaeological site. So it wasn't related to the site at all, but it seemed like at the time that this combination of just a little bit of metal, no trade beads, but a horse kind of suggested a very early contact period. And so they initially suggested a date of 1700 to 1750 for this site. And what happened was we went back and we started looking at this site. We ended up dating some butchered bison bone in the faunal assemblage, just radiocarbon dating it. And without getting into the weeds too much, radiocarbon dating this time period is really difficult because of the calibration effects late in the time period. But what we were able to do is impose a prior on it. We imposed a prior in Oxcal that said, all right, this site can't date past like 1842 when the Oregon Trail went right through this site. We made the assumption that this giant native encampment was not directly on the Oregon Trail. And so that eliminated a lot of the ambiguity in the radiocarbon dating and zeroed it into this really tight time range between 1700 and 1725 or so. So we kind of got lucky on the radiocarbon date, honestly, and it ended up matching up with the initial age estimate for it pretty well.
Excellent. So you guys have like a huge assemblage here. And in your paper, you guys state that you think like half of it is not in its original context, that it's been disturbed.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff was just, this site had already started to be developed into a house, into building a house on it. And so a lot of the artifacts that were collected as part of it were just kind of on the surface, dispersed across the surface. And there were a lot of controlled excavations that were undertaken here, but a lot of the artifacts were just kind of picked up and put in bags. So we knew that they were from this occupation. It's a single occupation site. There was nothing above it or below it, but it didn't have any spatial provenience to it.
Gotcha. And so you guys identified a total about 125 adornment artifacts at Riverbend. So this is both finished objects and preforms, but with the shell, the mollusk specimens, you guys are talking about like 2,627. And out of those, you analyzed half, 1346. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. Yeah, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. What we did with the analysis was a lot of the shells were just kind of waste product, right? It was just like tiny fragments of broken up shell. And the ones of those that actually had provenience that were tied to an actual excavation unit, we did weigh those, count those and weigh those so that we could produce some sort of like a heat map more or less of like how ubiquitous shell was across the site. The other stuff, we just didn't see a lot of analytical use in going to that extent if it's just kind of non-prevenient shell artifact. And then for the actual stuff that was actually shaped or ground down and like, at least moving towards the end product of like an adornment object, we did some more detailed analysis on that stuff.
Got you. It's a little bit on my wheelhouse, and this might be a Mike Page question, but with the Eastern Shoshone folks, were they tempering their pottery with riverine shells?
No. And there is no pottery on this site, I should clarify.
And no pottery. Dang, that's the best part. So you got a bunch of shells. You got over 2,600 shells and shell debitage, and they're being used for adornments, among other things. And is this, total, the adornment assemblage that you guys have from this site, does this make it the largest adornment assemblage in Wyoming from a single site?
I think so. If you don't count like the massive, there's been a couple burials that come out early in Wyoming's history that had thousands of glass trade beads in them. If you don't count each of those individually, then yeah, I think it is. And what makes it so unique is that there's really not another site that I know about in Wyoming that has kind of large scale adornment production at it. Where
gotcha.
This isn't just like people picking up a random bone and turning it into a bead, or a random stone and like putting a hole through it and turning it into a bead. Seems like a concerted effort to sit on a population of these freshwater shells and turn them into adornment objects. And so that's really why we brought Alexis in. It's like shells I very rarely see shells in the archaeological record in Wyoming. Like I come up with, a couple pieces and sites every now and then, like, oh, that's neat, something different. But here we had this massive assemblage of it that could really stand to have the eyes of a specialist on it. That's why we felt the need to bring in somebody that actually knew what they were talking about and like had actually looked at, I'm assuming, Alexis, thousands of shells by that point, but I don't know what exactly your background in shells is.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely be focusing most of the second segment with Alexis and Alexis's contributions on this assemblage. But it wasn't just the shells, right? You got elk ivory pendants. And for those that aren't listening, elk do have ivory. They're these two top back teeth that are pretty common. I think if people think of like Northern Plains women's dresses, you'll see those elk ivory pendants, and they might have hundreds on or about 100 on their shirt, and each elk gets 2. So that's a lot of elk for one shirt. But also, were some of those canid bones being used for adornments?
Yeah. So what makes this assemblage in my mind so special is that, it's not just the shells, it's diverse. So there's these elk ivory pendants, there's canid bone beads made out of like these really tiny little foot bones out of dogs. There's a ton of bird bone beads, which again, like I noted earlier, the assemblage is just full of bird bones, most of which are not modified into beads, but they're obviously like killing a lot of birds at this site, which is super interesting. I have to suspect that it has to do with its location right on kind of this ecosystem right on the North Platte River and like the trench where there's tons of trees relative to, miles around. And so it's probably a magnet for birds at certain times of the year, where they're converging on these riverine ecosystems to forage and nest and things like that. There's also a steatite bead, unfortunately, that was missing from the assemblage, but reported early on. There's an eagle bead of some sort. So just a super diverse assemblage of stuff. I should note one really interesting thing about the elk ivories is, these are such an iconic symbol of Plains Indian adornment, but in archaeological sites, in Wyoming at least, they don't really show up until the really early contact period. And elk ivories seem to be a thing that coincides with the introduction of trade goods for whatever reason. Also, in looking at some of the research on this, and a lot of this is kind of hearsay from trappers and like trapper journals, but elk ivories became so renowned that trappers actually began like carving fake elk ivory pendants out of like bison bone. And so they would just take a knife and like whittle bison bone into the shape of elk ivories and trade them into these communities. And so a lot of like the iconic photos you see of people wearing these really elaborate elk ivory shirts with just like, 100 elk ivories on them, they're probably bone. They're probably They're probably actually like just carved in the shape of elk ivories by trappers that got keyed in on the fact that these were really revered and just started kind of mass producing them, like whittling them around the campfire or whatever to trade into communities. So yeah, it's just super interesting, and a super interesting time period too, because it bridges this gap between kind of pre-contact and post-contact adornment practices, and those adornment practices seem to have changed quite a bit during that period as a result of kind of these larger market forces that were coming into play in these communities.
Excellent. And Alexis, you've been incredibly patient, so we're really excited to have you speak about your research here in the second segment. So with that, we'll be right back with segment 2 of episode 45. And welcome back to episode 45. So thank you so much, Spencer, for setting us up with the background of the site, all the adornments that are present here. And so really turning to you, Alexis. So you're a graduate student at the University of Wyoming, you're in the program of ecology, studying freshwater mussel conservation, and you're the recipient of the University of Wyoming Biodiversity Institute's Graduate Student Excellence Grant. So you're researching the white heel splitter within Devil's Tower National Monument. Is the white heel splitter a mussel? What is that?
It is, and mussels are amazingly named, second only to birds. So yeah, we have things like the white heel splitter, and I think that must have gotten its name from being stepped on and probably someone going, ouch. The species that we found at this site is the plain pocketbook, and it literally looks like a little fat pocketbook that is relatively drab. We have things like the purple warty back. Yeah, they're wonderfully named.
I just want everyone to know, because we can't, this is a podcast, so we couldn't see what Alexis just did, but Alexis just pulled a shell from on her table and showed it in the camera like an archaeologist does with a projectile pointer pots. That's fantastic. So how did you're not in the anthropology department, so how did you get roped into this paper to begin with?
I have a chapter on my PhD dissertation where, Wyoming really lacks a lot of historical information on freshwater mussels. We really only have one point in time where live surveys were done within recorded history. So we really can't go back in time and do more surveys. And our only resources are museum specimen collections, and no one, to my knowledge, has ever really looked into what the University of Wyoming houses in the archaeology collection in terms of what mussels we have there, any sort of mussel-focused questions on them. So I was already kind of doing that. And then Spencer reached out and said, hey, we're trying to put this paper together. Would you mind confirming some identification for these specimens? And I was more than happy to do that.
Excellent. And that's really neat and an awesome call to action about how archaeological collections in these museum repositories are not just for archaeologists, but they have use to other divisions, other fields of science. And so I think that's incredible that you realize that there was a wealth of specimens already present on campus that you had access to, that you can just dive on in. So I guess when Spencer asked you to look at these specimens, like you ended up looking at like about 1,300 pieces for analysis out of 2,600. Is that like typical in your line of work to be looking at like thousands upon thousands of shell debitage or mussel shells?
It wasn't really as bad as that sounds. A lot of the specimens that I really quickly glanced at were really tiny fragments, and really for mussel shell, you can't identify them unless you have at least a small portion of the hinge region, so the top part of the shell that holds both sides together. So a lot of it was just a quick pass, like, no, I can't identify that. No, I can't identify that. And then I ended up looking at, I think, 75 hinges where I was staring with a little microscope or like a hand lens and trying to see, okay, do they have raised loops on the little hinge part, or are they more shaped like an M? And that's really the only way you can tell this species from another one we have in Wyoming, the fat mucket. That and its general shell shape is a little more round and fat compared to the fat mucket, which is a little more elongate.
These mussel names are incredible. The fat
they're just great.
What's the story behind fat mucket? Do we know?
I actually don't know. I don't know what a mucket is, but
Fair enough. And you did get your master's at William and Mary, and you were studying oceanic shells. Do you prefer the riverine mussels to the ocean ones?
I think I do. They're much more interesting with their life history. So marine clams, they have it easy. They can spew out their larvae and they float around in the oceanic currents and can kind of travel anywhere the currents take them. But for riverine species, if they use that strategy, they can really only move downstream. So instead, freshwater mussels have evolved this coexisting relationship with native fish where they send out their larvae and their larvae attach to the gills and have a parasitic relationship for a couple of weeks to a couple of months on native fish species. And all that time, they're using the fish to travel up and down the streams, and then they fall off into a juvenile mussel and start growing.
That's crazy. So marine mussels are just notoriously coddled creatures.
Mussels. They don't deal with the same amount of pollution either, so they taste a lot better. I would not eat a freshwater mussel today.
Fair enough. So how can analyzing these mussel shells help us answer ecological questions about past environments or some of these archaeological contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I was saying before, we really lack any sort of historical information on what species we had in Wyoming pre-early 2010s or where those species were distributed within the state. So already we've been able to kind of make some conclusions on we're finding the archaeology specimens pretty much exactly where we would expect given their modern distributions, which is great. The plain pocketbook is especially interesting. This is a species that we think was locally extirpated from Wyoming and is currently being reintroduced to the North Platte Basin. And then I've found a couple of shells in the collection that are not species that we currently have in Wyoming. One of them is a species we found, the collective we, of course, not myself, but a species that has been found in Wyoming in one or two dead shell specimens, but never live. And we just found the third occurrence of it. And then I found one shell that even my mussel colleagues from the eastern part of the US, where this shell probably came, this species lives today, they couldn't even tell me what it was yet. So that was really exciting to find a potentially new to Wyoming species that used to live here that doesn't today. And then mussel shells grow similarly to trees in that they lay down annual rings that we can actually visually see and age, and we can tell information about how quickly or slowly shells are grown by the mussel. And this is really important because we can do that for modern specimens, but we really have nothing to put it into a greater context. And so if we do this with the archaeology shell and compare it to modern specimens, we can ask questions like, are mussels today growing slower or are they growing to smaller sizes? And is that indicative that today they're under conservation stress and we should be concerned about them? Because otherwise we really can't say if their growth today is normal.
Like you can actually kind of, by studying the archaeological specimens, you have a baseline for what kind of their natural health was basically prior to, diverting rivers for irrigation or putting hot water into rivers from power plants or things like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, this gives me a lot of ideas. I work downriver from Spencer in the Nebraska side of things and thinking about all the shells that we pull out of these same era contact sites. And we just look, mostly we don't look for speciation. It is, are the pots tempered with shell and what's the adornment, or are they using freshwater mussels as a subsistence strategy? So like hearing you talk about like, I should probably be going across the hall at the KU Natural History Museum to my colleagues, start some collaborations. But you also found a olivella species of mussel shell, correct?
Yeah, and actually, I don't know, Alexis, if you looked at that or not. You should if you hadn't. But there's two olivella shell beads from the site. I think basically convention states that most of those are coming from the Gulf of California, because there was pretty extensive trade in olivella shell from the Gulf of California through a lot of the southwestern tribes into the plains. And so I know Bob Horde has researched this in a lot of depth. for some southern and central plains sites and found that they most closely matched some stuff from the Gulf of California. So that stuff came from a long ways away. Those are almost certainly traded into these communities, I would say. But, maybe they were trading these other freshwater mussel shells out as well. They were certainly making a bunch of them. So, yeah, that was super interesting.
And there's a long history because there was that Olivella shell found at Rock Shelter.
Yeah. I should also mention, Alexis, you haven't looked at this one yet because it just came in last fall, but a site popped up on Glendo Reservoir last fall. Somebody found it because the water was down so low. And there's a couple of shell gorgets in it that are probably lightning whelk from the Gulf of Mexico.
Very interesting.
But I should have you look at it. I know it's marine shell because it's just so thick, and there's nothing that thick in Wyoming. But beyond that, I'm assuming it's lightning whelk because Mississippian groups really specialize in lightning whelk trade. But yeah, sidebar, I'm just telling Alexis this right now. It's probably not great for a podcast. But
this is great. This is great. Yeah,
it's a super cool thing. It's like, so there's that. And then there's one other instance of lightning whelk in the state that I know of. But it was certainly a thing, just a very rare thing to end up in Wyoming.
Absolutely. And so, Alexis, how big were these shells getting?
Their max size is around up to 7 inches. So they were a pretty hefty specimen.
Okay. And so I don't know anything about riverine mussels. So how close to shore are these? I mean, like these rivers out in Wyoming aren't super wide. They're not super deep, but like generally where are they within a river system?
This species has got a pretty thick shell and it's relatively large. So it is pretty robust and can live in some pretty swift moving water. That said, this species prefers mud, sand, or gravel that it can bury most of itself down into so that it doesn't float away down the river. A lot of mussels prefer slower moving parts of the riverway, so they're probably not out in the very center, really quick moving part of a really large river. You'll find them in like undercut banks or the muddier stream side.
What about like sandbars, like on the inside of bins?
Yeah, definitely. That's prime habitat where it slows down.
So to forage for these things, I've never tried to even find one of these, but to forage for these things, you'd basically just kind of maybe wade out into the river and start poking your hands around in the sand until you find one. Yeah,
they bury themselves in the sediment and there's a little part of them sticking up. And in slower, clearer, smaller streams, you can actually see them from above the water and they look like little cracked rocks. Very distinctive. Once you go out and hunt for them a little bit, you know what you're looking for. And then in anything that's more turbid, cloudy, larger, quicker moving, yeah, if it's shallow enough to do a hands and knees search. Otherwise, your feet can also find mussels really easily if you know what you're feeling for. It's hard to describe, but they feel like rocks, but not quite so hard. They have a little bit of softer give to them.
Okay. So as we start wrapping up, Alexis, what surprised you most from looking at the assemblage from this site? And on top of that, would you push your colleagues in your department and in your discipline in general to work more with archaeologists and archaeological collections to understand past ecosystems?
Absolutely. I was pleasantly surprised by how much good material there was just from this one site and how many questions I could think to ask about just the mussels themselves and what kind of things we can learn about them using this resource that's never been looked into. And I would definitely say get out there and work across other departments.
Excellent. And Spencer, final thoughts from you. Why are adornment studies such as these remain important for understanding Indigenous histories and social worlds?
Well, I hadn't really ever thought about adornment all that much until, Dave Eccles, who really kind of initiated this study and he's the second author on it. He was the one that really recognized the importance of this for adornments. But what I came to appreciate about it is just the plains is a very big, and a very visible landscape, both in terms of how far you can see across it, but also when you see somebody like riding a horse across the plains at you from a mile away, it's really helpful if they're wearing something that you recognize as friendly. And that's how I started kind of thinking about it, was that, these adornments are They're not just kind of, something that you fancy and that you think's really neat looking. It actually has like a very defined purpose in a landscape like this, where you need to signal who you are and where you're coming from in a very defined way on a regular basis. So I started thinking about them like that. I also was really struck when I started comparing the adornments we were finding at this site to the very earliest depictions of Plains Indians and like Carl Bodmer watercolors from the 1830s. By God, some of that stuff in those paintings was identical to the stuff we were finding at this site from the early 1700s. And it really made me connect to the archaeological record in a lot more direct way than I really ever had been before. Because I'm typically looking at sites that are 12 or 13,000 years old, and all of a sudden I have this assemblage of adornments that were painted by this weird German guy that, struck up the middle Missouri in the 1830s and painted the same damn stuff on people. And it was just it's kind of a powerful realization to be like, okay, here's the stuff in the archaeological record, here's the stuff in an actual painting. And this was, real stuff that had real meaning to people. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling a little bit about it, but after thinking about adornments a lot, I have a lot more appreciation for their meaning in the archaeological record, and their importance in the archaeological record is just like a defined kind of topic of study in what we do.
Isn't the Plains Village period just so fun, Spencer? You can always come to this side of the timeline and have a much, much greater wealth of archaeological material to look at.
It is really fun. I think I might just like strike a balance and just study like the most boring middle archaic site that I can find in Wyoming. So it's got to be like 5,500 years old somewhere.
Excellent. There's nothing but bison bone and an earthen oven. Well, all right.
One
Thank you
bison bone and a fire-cracked rock feature. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast. Alexis, it's a pleasure to get to hear about this research. I mean, like, just listening to you talk has definitely fired some synapses in my brain about like some collaborations here. But yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining. There is a link to their article down below. You have to be a member of Plains Anthropological Society or at a research institution that has access. And so by joining the Plains Anthropological Society, you have access to the Plains Anthropologist, the quarterly journal, and you'll have access to all the back catalogs. So you'll be able to find their article there. So both the citations down in the episode description, a link to Plains Anthropological Society's website, and a link to the journal itself. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I will see you guys next time on the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.